Steins Gate is one of the most popular and critically acclaimed anime series, with well over 1 million members on MAL, and a pretty much permanent second place ranking with an average score of 9.12. Nearly 90% of the people who've seen it have given the show an 8, 9 or a 10, which to me indicates that you'd be a fan of the show. So it seems odd to me how little people investigate beyond this. I know using MAL numbers might not be the best statistical measurement, but look how extreme these numbers are. 3 times as many people saw Steins Gate than the movie, 4 times as many people saw it than Steins Gate 0, 6 times as many people saw it than the first entry in the series, ChäoS Head, 13 times as many people saw it than the sequel Robotics Notes, and 25 times as many people saw it than ChäoS Child. Actually, that one makes a bit more sense, understandable being too closely tied to ChäoS Head. I think most people who've seen all these other shows will agree, Steins Gate is definitely the superior anime, but that's the important part. Superior anime, and this franchise is far more than that. The Science Adventure series, as it's collectively known, is currently made up of 6 core games. Probably 7 actually, but we'll get to that later. ChäoS Head, Steins Gate, Robotics Notes, ChäoS Child, Steins Gate 0, and Robotics Notes Dash. I say games, but really I mean visual novels. What's a visual novel? It's like a game but without the game part. Or a book with pictures and music and, usually, voice acting. The first 5 of these all have anime adaptations, and I expect Dash will eventually get one too. Until a few months ago, my exposure to this series was limited to the various anime adaptations of Steins Gate, Robotics Notes, and the original Steins Gate visual novel, which I actually played quite a long time ago, back when it was first translated into English. Oh, and I'd seen the first 2 episodes of ChäoS Head a couple of years ago. I actually really liked them, but a bunch of other things came up and I completely forgot about it. Alright, so I was at the point where I had so many anime that I wanted to finish, I was struggling with decision fatigue. So I took a very easy way out, and went in alphabetical order. I promise you there's a point to this. It didn't take long for me to get through my A's and B's, and so I landed in the C's, and found ChäoS Head. I wanted to pace the anime out with a few episodes a day, but I ended up binging it over 2 days. I enjoyed it, but I felt how much more unfulfilled potential it had. So I found a fan patch of the visual novel, and from there I fell deeper and deeper and deeper, and you get the idea. This was all back in September 2020, right as I stopped uploading videos. In the months that followed, I played through all 7 subsequent translated VNs. I watched all the anime adaptations, read a bunch of spin-off content, audio dramas, the works. It was probably over 300 hours of content that I experienced, a pretty daunting prospect. Usually that'd be too much for me, but I didn't see it like that. I just saw the individual game, and then I thought, alright, time for one more, every single time. Given how much this was partially responsible for my big video hiatus, it only seemed fair that I use it to make a video. And thus we can finish this preamble, and move on to the beginnings of this franchise. ChäoS Head kickstarted the series in 2008, and introduced many concepts that would appear in subsequent releases. However, there's still a minor but very clear case of early installment weirdness, making ChäoS Head feel very much like its own beast. It was set in Shibuya, in the far-off future of 2009, starting a trend of being set 1 year in the future that you'll regularly see come up in these games. The protagonist was Nishijo Takumi, a 17-year-old incel who, at least at the start of the game, can barely function as a human being. He's frequently lost in his own delusions or hallucinations, and is generally a pretty pathetic character. I'm really selling you on this, aren't I? But this honestly is part of the game's strengths. Being able to see Takumi's thoughts, thanks to this being a visual novel, helps you to understand him, even if you can't relate to him. Throughout the story, he really is pushed to breaking point, and though slow, his growth from this experience is undeniable, and really compelling. Takumi is the perfect character for the narrative this game goes for, with his immense trust issues and paranoia helping to create a uniquely uneasy and tense atmosphere. Alright, the actual narrative. I won't give major spoilers in this video, I'll generally avoid talking about the second halves of these games. A series of bizarre and horrific murders are taking place in Shibuya, known as the New Generation Madness, and Takumi appears to have some sort of connection to them. Along the way, all manner of conspiracies surface. The Committee of 300, the overarching antagonist of the franchise, manipulating governments and science institutions, mind control powers, mass illusions, and probably the part of the science adventure series furthest away from real science, real booting. Real booting is where someone can physically manifest something that exists in their imagination. A relatively non-spoiler example would be a sword, since they appear a lot. This isn't just an illusion, it can physically interact with the world, which presents a scientific problem. The game does attempt a scientific explanation, with quantum mechanics, collapsing wave functions, and the Dirac Sea, but it does effectively work like magic. As the reader, you have some interaction with Takumi. At various points, you're able to choose if Takumi has a positive or negative delusion, as well as Takumi having his own delusions separate from what you pick. This leads to both the audience and Takumi being unable to distinguish fiction from reality at times, helping to create a suspenseful atmosphere. There's so many unnerving moments as the conspiracy closes in on Takumi, who, as the prime suspect, is unsure if he himself is innocent. I've not really talked about the other main characters, but that's because at its core, ChäoS Head is a character study of one incredibly socially isolated guy. Though these other main characters are still all incredibly important to how Takumi changes and how he relates to each person. The other reason I can't talk too much about the game's main narrative is because of how many out there twists are thrown in your face. It's a roller coaster, and despite being the shortest main game by a significant margin, there's at least as many twists and turns as the next science adventure game. These twists help to blur the line over what is real, and further break Takumi's already fragile mental state. A part of this series that serves as a through line between all entries is the relationship between people and technology, and specifically social media. Yes, there's the main narrative of literally using technology to influence how people perceive the world through hallucinations, but a less obvious part of this is probably scarier. Takumi is a regular user of online chat rooms and @channel, a fictional social media site. His interactions on these sites have warped his worldview, and through regular moments where the player can browse @chan, you can contrast Takumi's reaction to the horrific events of the game that directly affect him, with the carefree attitude of his fellow @chan users, who turn it into a meme. These themes are certainly refined in later entries, but the groundwork was laid here. This game is fantastic, dare I say possibly even a masterpiece. But compared to later entries it feels less of a full experience. And I don't just mean because it's shorter. The UI feels a lot less polished and the gameplay structure is pretty simple. Your first playthrough has 2 endings focused solely on one choice right at the end, and they're not really that different. There's also an alternative route only available on a second run, which requires a bunch of incredibly specific choices without much real indication of what the correct choices are, basically necessitating a guide. Another shortcoming of this game I've heard come up a lot is that the cast are underutilised, especially compared to later games. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. The game is very much centred around Takumi rather than anyone else, but it would be no bad thing to develop these other characters further. And it seems like to some extent the science adventure team felt this game had potential yet to fill too, as the next release in the series was ChäoS Head Noah, an updated version of the original game. It near doubled the length of the original and added in new routes for the main heroines. These routes not only let each of the main characters have their own moments to shine, but further revealed secrets of the story. As well as new routes, the true ending was expanded on, and the graphics updated too. This is pretty much the definitive version of ChäoS Head, and it's not available in English. Given how all the other main entries have been officially released, it's highly likely that one day we'll get an official release of Noah. In the meantime, there's a fan patch currently under development by the Committee of Zero, and they're making pretty regular progress. If this video takes forever to edit, it might even be out by now, making this point moot. If it isn't though, you'll be able to find an English patch of the base game if you Google around. As well as a remake, there's one other notable alternative version of this story, the anime. I said I enjoyed it earlier, so I'm gonna give a controversial opinion here. It's clearly inferior, and if you're only going to experience one, please experience the visual novel. But I think the anime adaptation is a different experience. The ChäoS Head anime is a rather loose adaptation. Makes sense it's under a quarter the runtime of the VN. While this does result in many great scenes unfortunately being removed, it also ends up changing the tone somewhat. The level of suspense is gone, and in its place there's a much more manic energy. You don't end up with anywhere near as much time to think over the mysteries, you just strap in and go along for the ride. Towards the second half, the anime takes greater liberties with the plot, and there's a lot of anime original content. If the visual novel wasn't readily available, I'd take issue with this, but it's available. With a 12-episode runtime, I much prefer telling a slightly different story, rather than simply failing to tell an existing one. It's certainly a weaker narrative, but it doesn't feel phoned in, and for its original ideas, I believe it has good reason to exist. As well as this, ChäoS Head received a sequel visual novel, not ChäoS Child, ChäoS Head Love Choo Choo, which again isn't released in English. There's not even any good translated summaries of this game. Thankfully, it doesn't have too much major story content that we miss out on, as, while canon, it's more of a light-hearted dating sim. It does, however, further continue the development of Takumi, showing him becoming much more sociable and actively engaging with the world. The only real important thing here is that Takumi loses the powers he gained over the first game and becomes a normal human. There's also various drama CDs, manga, and light novels. Mostly canon, but unfortunately, also mostly untranslated. However, there is one translated, very short story called ChäoS Gate, which released just before Steins Gate. It's set during ChäoS Head, a year before Steins Gate, and features Okabe, the main character of Steins Gate, getting into trouble with one of the ChäoS Head girls due to his Chunibyo antics. Which provides a nice segue into the Steins Gate part of this video. As I mentioned before, Steins Gate is much more popular than any other part of this franchise, and this has led to it being milked for all it's worth. I'll put a link in the description to a good catalogue of science adventure media, so you can see the extent to which I'm talking about. It's sort of like Persona compared to the rest of Megami Tensei, where one branch of the franchise has become the franchise's identity, especially true in international audiences, where other games have utilised Steins Gate in the marketing more than the science adventure brand. The official Facebook community page for the franchise is listed as Steins Gate Community, and the subreddit is r/Steinsgate. I mean, even I'm guilty of this. My already limited audience would be even less if I didn't put Steins Gate in the title. Steins Gate originally released in 2009 for the Xbox 360, before getting ported to basically everything. Probably if you've chosen to watch this, you'll have at least seen the anime, but for all three of you who haven't, here's a 30-second summary. Okabe is a mad scientist / first-year university student, making useless inventions with his friends. He accidentally creates a machine that can send short text messages back in time, and this ends up getting him way in over his head and involved in major conspiracies that helps decide the fate of the world. Only 18 seconds. Okabe is incredibly overdramatic as part of his mad scientist act, but it's just that, an act. This is made clear in both the visual novel and the anime, but in the VN, since you get to see his inner monologue, you can see hints of this from earlier. The cast as a whole are all incredibly likeable. They begin off as eccentric and tropey characters, but pretty much everyone is putting on some sort of facade, just like Okabe. And this contrast between their inner and outer personas helps make them feel like real people with layers. As a time travel plot, things don't always make sense when you'd expect them to, especially towards the start. But that is part of what makes the story so incredibly satisfying when things finally click into place. Multiple moments from even the prologue become important later, and these reward attentive readers. All the little details linking into the twists, and not just those related to time travel, makes for a lot of rewatch value. I say rewatch value because the anime in particular is good in this regard. After all, it's much easier to rewatch a 9-hour anime than reread a 30-hour visual novel. One of the reasons the anime is so successful, aside from just generally great direction, is that its visual novel structure is pretty linear. Ironic for a story about time travel, yeah. There's basically only one route with 3 side endings that, rather than their own routes, are just early alternative endings at various points. There are also endings for Krisu and Mayuri. Technically these are separate routes, as they split early on, but the plot is pretty much identical until the end for both of these. Another success of the anime is that they knew what to cut. There's plenty of changes, such as significantly reducing Ferris's chapter, cutting out a fairly infamous scene with Nae, and removing references to the Committee of 300 entirely. But these changes really work, and it's all to do with one thing that every VN in this series does masterfully: build up and payoff. Nearly every plot point from the later sections has build up from early on. Some of these, like the metal Ooper that Mayuri loses at the start, are vital to the plot. But what the anime gets is that there's a lot of build up that isn't needed for the story to make sense, but that gives the payoff that much more impact. Like, for example, the story didn't need Krisu to tell Okabe about her relationship with her estranged father, but without that little scene, the final episode would feel lacking. But on the other side, they needed to shrink the story down into 24 episodes. There was a whole arc that they cut about Faris's Rhinet tournament, with a separate villain and everything. This was largely a self-contained story though, so cutting it didn't reduce any later payoff. And since this was cut, an earlier Faris Rhinet tournament in the May Queen Cafe was also reduced, since Rhinet as a whole became much less relevant to the plot. The anime was made a lot more standalone than the visual novel. References to Nightheart, Takami's username, and the Committee of 300 that were in the visual novel don't appear. However, these references ultimately aren't necessary to the plot or character growth, and with the committee, reducing their presence to just CERN, who in the visual novel are a frontman for the committee, simplified the story. Probably one of my favourite links to ChäoS Head was impossible to remove from the anime though. The time leap machine Krisu creates uses visual rebuilding technology, the patent for which is discussed in ChäoS Head, and involves sending electronic signals to the human brain, a major element of ChäoS Head. In ChäoS Head, this patent comes from an American university, the same Mitochondria University that Krisu works at. But of course, Steins Gate doesn't just end with the original. Even with visual novels, there's 2 notable spin-offs. Steins Gate, My Darling's Embrace, which is a comical dating sim, so kind of like Love Choo Choo, but non-canon. Set in the Delta Attractor field of world lines, where the timelines are much more peaceful. There's a route for Krisu, Mayuri, Morika, Faris, Suzuha, and Luca. Male version. In my opinion, it's the weakest game in the series, but it does have some pretty nice character moments every so often. The Krisu route was pretty much the only one I particularly cared for, but I should give the Luca route special mention, especially with how it tied into ChäoS Head thematically by projecting delusions into reality. By the way, just to clear up any confusion, Ruka from the anime has been translated to Luca in the visual novel. The second spin-off is much more worthwhile. Linear Bounded Phonogram. It's a collection of 11 short stories, mostly told by various guest writers, including one by Kotaro Uchikoshi, known for his work with the Zero Escape series. Each of the 8 lab members gets one, as well as Mr. Brown and Nae, with Okabe getting a second. The canonicity of these stories are questionable. Some are light-hearted and set in the aforementioned Delta Attractor field, but a couple others could very clearly be slotted into the main story, either as timelines that happened but we the audience didn't see, or as alternative timelines branching off at specific moments. Overall, nearly every story here managed to have both humorous and emotional moments at varying levels. I want to point to 2 in particular though. The final short story, Nae's, which tells a story 2 years later on in one specific world line where Daru, on the run from CERN, needs Nae's help to rebuild the phone wave time machine. It's nothing particularly special on paper, but it's surprisingly sweet, and even though it's in a separate timeline, it provides a good foundation for their relationship in Robotics Notes Dash, which we'll get to eventually. The other is Krisu's story. the only one that I can see definitely fitting in the main timeline. It really helped to add to Okabe and Kirisu's relationship from Kirisu's perspective, and it functioned as a sort of mini Steins Gate Zero for one particular scene. Steins Gate Zero, well, before I talk about that, we've got to look at some other Steins Gate media, as Zero took a lot of inspiration from a couple of other sources. The main source is the Epigraph trilogy of light novels. These were set in a timeline where Okabe failed to save Kirisu at the end of Steins Gate, and eventually led to World War III breaking out over Kirisu's time travel paper. Along the way, he met Professor Leskinen and Maho from Kirisu's university, who were studying the AI Amadeus. Mayuri's daughter from the future, Kaguri, also appeared. If you've seen the anime for Zero, this will all sound very familiar. The other source is the drama CD, Arclight at the Point of Infinity, which came out even earlier. This is set in a similar timeline, but instead focuses on Mayuri and Suzuha, ending with the pair going back in time to convince past Okabe to save Kirisu. There's a lot more Steins Gate media out there, like, a lot more, and it's all really interesting reading about, but I'm not going to go on for an hour just about that. Because of Steins Gate's structure of world lines, there can be all sorts of stories that are in their own way canon. Every world line we see in the original story has a future, even if that future isn't shown to us, and these spin-off media can help to show these futures. Speaking of unseen futures, we arrive at Steins Gate Zero, our third major game we're talking about. I first saw this through the anime and, honestly, I had a lot of issues with it. It felt unnecessary, telling the future of a timeline I wasn't interested in, a very similar one to the aforementioned Epigraph trilogy. In the original Steins Gate, we spend most of our time in the Alpha world lines, so personally, that's the future I would be more interested in seeing, rather than this. However, over time and through playing the visual novel, I've come to gain more appreciation for Zero. I'd still rate it lower than the original, but that's just me going from a 10 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10. Zero has a pretty unique structure to it. I've seen some people say how cool it is that the game's root looks like a zero, but it doesn't really. It looks more like this. Routes are decided in a pretty simple way. There's a couple of moments where you're given choices between action and inaction. In most cases, it's a choice between answering the phone or not answering. However, the one central choice that determines which major branch you end up on is slightly different. Okabe, in his inner monologue, suggests turning off his phone, but if you just advance the text, he won't. You, as the player, have to actively press the button to take out your phone and press the button to turn it off. Because the choice is made much less obvious, despite it being the most game-changing one, it gives more agency to the player. To the reader? I'm never quite sure on visual novels which I should use. The other interesting part of this structure is the weird line in the middle, the D-Rhine. This determines if you get the true ending or not, which is more of a bonus epilogue than anything else, but it's still worth it. If you complete the phone off route, at the end Okabe will send the D-Rhine back in time to his past self. He then sees this message on the other route, where his phone is on, which unlocks the extra epilogue after finishing this main path. There's a lot of other elements that make Zero its own distinct being, separate from the original. Many visual novels, including Steins Gate, limit you to just one perspective character. That's not the case with Steins Gate Zero. Here you get to spend a lot of time with characters other than Okabe. Getting to inhabit the headspace of characters is one of the biggest advantage visual novels have over simply TV stories. And here we get large sections as Daru, Suzuha, newcomer Maho, and the rest of the returning core cast. Time travel is still a part of the focus, and of course conspiracy theories too, as is the case in every entry, but it's only part of the focus. An element from ChäoS Head that was reduced in Steins Gate was the brain, and that's coming back strong here. The AI Amadeus is based on Kirisu's memories, and it raises the question of what the difference is. Memories also factor into Kaguri's story in a big way, both her own missing memories and Kirisu's. This really raises a question of what makes a person who they are, if not their memories, and, in different timelines, Kaguri can have a completely different personality, even with the same early history. I only really talked about the phone on versus phone off route, but as you can see from the flowchart, there's more than just that. These 3 extra endings are a lot more notable than the 3 side endings of the original game. These are more like actual routes, with unique chapters rather than just endings. The Maho and Kagari endings in particular add really important information, and I wish that these were also required for the true ending, as it could easily be worked through time travel to make them needed. The Leskinen end, however, feels much more like a standard bad end. Speaking of different routes, the anime is sort of like a third main branch. It straddles the line between the 2 main routes of the VN, as well as adding in elements from the aforementioned side routes. I mentioned earlier that I wasn't a fan of the Zero anime at first, but treating it like another route rather than a full adaptation really helped. There are parts of the story where the anime just skims over it or leaves plot threads hanging, but a lot of these are covered in other routes of the VN. It's common in VNs for questions from one route to be answered in other routes, and that's the same here. In fact, to give an example, the identity of this masked attacker isn't revealed in either main route of the VN. You need to watch the anime to answer that question. I don't think it's necessarily confirmed, but I like to see the Okabe we follow in the anime as being the one after the phone-on route in the VN. Let me explain. None of these Okabes succeed. We saw the successful Okabe in the original, but this original Okabe was only successful because of his selves in these now erased futures. The 3 Okabes we see, 2 in the main VN branches, 1 in the anime, are the Zeros. In the VN, the second Okabe is only more successful because of what the previous one did, and there's plenty more Okabes that we don't see that influence the actions of the few that we did see. However, this is kinda complicated and can lead to either large plot holes or a lot of mental gymnastics required to make every little detail make sense. And I think this is part of why I prefer the original. The scope of this is so much greater than what's in the original series. It's set over a year rather than just a few weeks, and there's not just CERN, there's also Stratofor, Derpa and the Russians. So many different factions, and you actively see the start of events on a worldwide scale. This is in some ways a positive, but I think it has a lot of downsides with a less clear focus. I love time travel stories, but they're so easy to break when you think too hard about them. And this grander scale just ended making what was a really tightly plotted time travel story a lot less strongly held together. Of course, the links to Steins Gate are obvious, but this game also came out after ChäoS, and also Robotics Notes and ChäoS Child, which we haven't visited yet. ChäoS gets a decent nod in the hospital, seen in the second half of the game. Though it has been remodelled, this is the same hospital that features heavily in ChäoS. Given shady goings on in both, it seems like the Committee of 300 likely still have some hold between the games. ChäoS Child and Robotics Notes haven't taken place yet, but the focus on AI seen in Zero is very important to Robotics Notes, and ChäoS Child at least gets an Easter egg of the sumo stickers. If we move forward 5 years from the ending of Steins Gate, we get to ChäoS Child. Okay, so let me say this first. While other entries come close, ChäoS Child has to be my favourite entry into this series. It also just so happens to be the longest. It was released in English before an official release of ChäoS, which in my eyes is an absolute sin. Not only does the narrative have clear ties to ChäoS, but it plays with your expectations, assuming you've read the original. Many characters and events parallel those from Head, but equally you can get cases where it's a direct contrast to the original. For example, the main character Takeru shares a nickname with Takumi. Both begin the game with a pretty sizable rod up their arse and look down on those around them. Both live alone in a tiny single room. Takeru even seems to idolise Takumi to an extent without ever knowing him. But in many aspects they are also incredibly different. Takeru despises otaku, and while he also does have some major issues with forming connections to people, he's nowhere near as socially isolated as Takumi, and even has friends. His relationship with his family is also completely different. Takeru isn't Takumi, and if you're going to read this VN, that's something very important to remember. At the start, I genuinely found Takeru to be one of the most despisable protagonists in any VN I'd ever played. Yet over the 40 hours or so I spent with him, I came to love him. He didn't seem like a caricature, he felt like a real person who could exist. He's obsessive and has this big thing about being on the right side of the information divide, wanting to know as much about everything as possible, and looking down on those who don't. And I think to at least some extent, a lot of the readers may find something they can relate to him in this. So the actual premise? There's a series of bizarre murders mimicking those from ChäoS Head, but 6 years later. Unlike Takumi, Takeru has a much more active role. He's the president of his school's newspaper club, and loves the excitement of this big murder case, so he starts to investigate it, and ends up well in over his head. This VN takes everything I loved in ChäoS Head and improves on it. The atmosphere was incredible. I played the first chapter at about 2 AM in a dark room, and I was genuinely so scared. I played it on the PS4, and there are moments when dialogue comes through the PS4 remote rather than the TV. This scene freaked me out, and I didn't expect it. It really helped sell me on the vibe of the game. After the first chapter, I felt as though it did get a little bit weaker, but this allowed for some good character moments, and come the midpoint of the game, things really start hitting you, and they don't stop. The stream of reveals that change everything you previously knew about the game manage to feel incredibly natural and well spaced out, yet they're so fast paced and manage to keep the tension high for the whole third act of the common route. The common route comes to a fantastic close, and if the game were to end here, it would already be one of my favourite visual novels, but there's still plenty more. After finishing the common route, you unlock a bunch of side character routes, and their unlock criteria are a little poorly signposted. I looked up a guide, and I'd probably recommend you do so too. But if you're really opposed to that, I wish you the best of luck. These character routes are required to complete in order to unlock the true ending, and they consist of one incredibly long chapter that branches off the main story. These routes are really good, and you learn all sorts of details missing from the main plot. One may explore a character's past, helping you to understand why they're the way they are. Another might answer massive questions left hanging by the main route, or reveal the identity of a villain you didn't even think about in the first story. Once you've done all of these, a new option will appear on the title screen, letting you pick the true ending from the start screen, as a sequel story to the common route. And this is something that all games we're going to be talking about from now on do. This true ending may feel like just an epilogue, and it's a lot slower paced, but it still does provide its own reveals. I've heard some claims that the reveal early in this ending comes out of nowhere, but actually little pieces of evidence appear throughout the common route. One of the first murders in the prologue even hints at this in a throwaway line, as well as explaining another incredibly minor unsolved mystery. By the time the post-credits scene had played, I was immensely satisfied, but more than anything else, I was filled with a great sense of closure. Despite being a visual novel, this actually gave me RPG vibes, especially Persona 4, despite the clearly darker tone. It's a team of teenagers aged between 14 and 18 on a quest to solve a supernatural murder case. As the story develops, new characters are drawn into the case and join the party, as it were. However, unlike Persona 4, the police do seem a lot more competent and cooperative. I enjoy how this party grows, and despite there being this big serial killer on the loose in Shibuya, the story actually feels a lot more smaller and personal because of how it's focused centrally on these people and their reactions to the situations they're forced into. He doesn't appear on screen directly, but Takumi's presence is still felt. The committee are after him in several routes, and in one particular route, he's used as a pretty significant plot element, which really surprised me, so I'm not going to spoil it for you. However, I can definitely talk about Momose, a support to the detective in the original, who returns to support the new detective in Child. Likewise, a couple of Steins characters get directly involved, with one being a friend of Kurisu, and Robotics notes, well, it hasn't taken place in the timeline yet, but 2015 is a very important date in the Robotics notes backstory, so they do have a good few references here to help sell that it's a shared universe. That would be a good time to move on to Robotics notes itself, but as usual, there's some more ChäoS Child I need to mention. Firstly, we have the anime. Now, I loved the anime for Steins Gate, I enjoyed the one for ChäoS Head, and though I didn't like it at first, I've since come to appreciate the anime for Zero too. So how did I feel about ChäoS Childs? My favourite VN in the whole series? It was kinda bad, like, not offensively bad, it just felt like a 4-hour recap episode. Yes, 4 hours, the longest VN in the series gets the shortest anime. The anime just adapts the common route, and a bit of the Nono route. Pretty much everything is there, just in an incredibly bare bones way. And the sumo stickers, ugh, what did they do to you? I know this is a nitpick, but Why? Why do they feel the need to change the design of this recurring plot element that is significantly special because of its exact design? Surely it can't be a rights issue since it appeared fine in the VN, and it's still the science adventure team overseeing all projects, so why? The anime just feels so lifeless and missing any sort of character. It really is just a recap episode. However, there was at least one episode that I thought was worth it. Episode 7. I can't really show it here because it really would spoil one of the best parts of the story, but if you've played the VN, it's the moment when the shit really hits the fan. Since the anime only adapts the common route, which I think is for the best, as it makes a good standalone ending, the true end ended up being released as a quote-unquote movie with a runtime of just under 50 minutes. I think the movie managed things a little better than the show. It had less time pressure so they could fit in a bit more meat on the bones. However, it wasn't without issue. Firstly, the antagonist of the true end is an antagonist from one of the routes not adapted in the main anime. I think they had maybe one line, but they were absent from the rest of the show, making this appearance feel as though it came out of the blue. The other issue comes from the fact that it's just a different form of media than a visual novel, and there's one plot element that is spoiled in the anime because of this difference in medium. But just like ChäoS Head, as well as an anime, there's a VN sequel, ChäoS Child Love Choo Choo. Even though it also isn't currently available in English, detailed summaries of the routes from this game exist, which is how I experienced it. The premise of the game is that there's a new, superpowered gigolomaniac, with the power to rewrite fate, thus undoing all the events of the previous game, and instead you play a light-hearted dating sim version of the original. However, all is not as it seems, and this is canon. There are routes for the 5 main heroines, and Taku's adoptive younger sister is also added, as well as a joke route for his best friend Ito. Between completing routes you'll get short scenes, telling a more serious plot, which ends up leading to the true ending, by which the status quo of the original game is restored, and the cast do still retain some memory of this at least. I'd consider the two ChäoS games to be their own separate entities, much more so than Steins Gate and Steins Gate Zero. There's still a lot in common between the two, but if you want to consider each main entry as having 2 canon games as part of it, then the Love Choo Choo games can function as the second for each ChäoS game. I split it up in this way to deal with pairs of games together, and also to keep things in chronological order. So at last we're dealing with the 2 Robotics Notes games. The Robotics Notes duology are easily the most laid-back and relaxed games in the series. That's not to say there's not the usual main character getting too deep in a conspiracy theory, it wouldn't be a science adventure game without that. Where all the other games have been set in various parts of Tokyo, Robotics Notes is set on Tanegashima Island, a small island off the southern coast of Japan. This location really does help to make the tone, but this relatively quiet rural setting makes a good juxtaposition for the big plot elements of AI, augmented reality, and of course robotics. This story is set over 2019 to 2020, lasting around 9 months. When the game came out, unlike previous entries, this was more than just 1 or 2 years in the future. It released back in 2012, so the near future it was telling had to be a little different from the present. In the world of Robotics Notes, there was a robot boom in the mid-2010s, thanks to a fictitious robot anime gun barrel. This robot boom has resulted in a different technological landscape to our 2019. The premise for this game is a group of high schoolers building a giant robot, but it's obviously about a lot more than just this. The Committee of 300 are the most visible here compared to any other game in the series, and the main character Kai spends a lot of time investigating them. There's really 5 main characters in this VN. You could stretch that up to 7, adding in Airi and Nai, but then why not count Doc or Michi or Mizuka, so I'm just going to call it 5. The 5 main members of the Robotics Club. Kaito is our main character, and he's probably the least eccentric science adventure protagonist. In fact, before I played the game and had just seen the anime, he felt kinda bland. But after playing the VN, I think a lot higher of him as a character. Kai is pretty apathetic, he doesn't seem to outwardly care about much. However, he's incredibly obsessive and competitive. He's a big fighting game player, currently ranked number 5 in his game of choice, Kill Ballad, and he's determined to become the best in the world. He's lazy, but in a smart way. Or I guess, smart in a lazy way. His main motivations for putting in effort is to save himself future effort. But he doesn't want to be seen as a hard worker because then he'd be relied on more. He does a lot to support his childhood friend Akiho, but he usually does it in secret without her realising the effort he's putting in. Akiho is the other really notable member. She's definitely the protagonist of this story. Plenty of characters get moments as a perspective character, but other than Kaito with his clear lead, she definitely takes second place. Given Kai's largely passive role for a good portion of the plot, in regards to this, she sort of fulfills a protagonist role, since she functions as the leader of the group, and her optimistic energy is what drives the plot forward. The relationship between these two main characters is probably at the core of this VN more than any other entry. With Kai and Aki, I think the story lives or dies depending on how invested you are in this relationship. They each rely on the other, and both state on many occasions how they consider themselves to be one half of a whole person. I've seen people, especially anime-onlys, thinking that their romantic relationship was forced or came out of left field, but to me that just doesn't make sense. It's hard to see their interactions throughout this game, and not even consider it being romantically coded as a clear possibility. The other club members also get their time to shine in this game, to be expected with the game having the second longest runtime next to ChäoS Child. In fact, I think this probably does even more than ChäoS Child to flesh its characters out, giving them plenty of screen time each. And unlike ChäoS Child's routes, each alternative route in this game is canon as part of the main story, meaning that this has the longest canon playtime. The route structure is a little awkward. You can very definitely divide the story into 3 acts of 4 chapters each. The first 4 chapters, called phases, are linear and your choices don't matter too much. The plot is more light-hearted here. The stakes are stuff like the robot club being shut down or not having enough funding to finish the giant robot gun build 1. This mostly serves as setup for the overall plot, and sets up character arcs and dynamics. The group begins as just Akiho and Kaito, but by the end the team has grown to add in Subaru, Jun, Frau, and you could even add Irie and Nai. During the 5th phase, however, you can switch onto different routes, depending on what tweets you reply to. You could finish the 5th phase, which would be the Nai route, but you could also jump to the 6th, 7th, or 8th phases too, Jun, Frau, and Irie's chapters respectively. In terms of story, they naturally follow on from each other, usually with a couple of weeks in between, but it could be easy to view the 8th phase before even finishing the 5th. However, thankfully, while all are needed to understand the overall story, each chapter is largely self-contained, focusing on each character in turn. These provide some payoff to the setup from the first act, and overall the plot starts to take a more serious tone here. The main bulk of the plot is around the Kimijima reports, an in-universe sort of ARG where accomplishing certain tasks in the real world, using the AR app Iroh, unlocks these hidden reports scattered throughout Tanegashima. The activities to unlock these reports, stuff like surf a wave, get a bullseye with a bow and arrow, and stare at one particular spot in a cave for hours on end, 3 days in a row, all happen naturally as the story progresses, with each chapter mostly featuring one particular report. However, finding the report is an actual activity for the player, and can be a little frustrating. From my perspective though, it really did help with the immersion as I was playing on an undocked Switch, and it felt like I was actively searching in AR for these report markers. These reports expose the committee's plans, and this is where the regular conspiracy theory comes in. Despite seeming reluctant, Kaito manages to find them all and clear the requirements. They're pretty gamified, and being an obsessive gamer is a big part of Kaito's character, so he goes through with it until he's too deep in this conspiracy. The stakes are raised in the second act, however they're mostly raised outside of the main cast's bubble. Big events happen, but mostly off-screen or in the background. You'll find out about them through Twippo, where you can read what people are saying, and even see the opinions of a couple of previous science adventure main characters. The later the chapter though, the more these big events happening in Tokyo start to affect Tanegashima and our main cast. But it's well paced to give good build-up and escalation. Combined with the Kimijima reports, it gives the perfectly ominous feeling of the noose being tightened that this series is great at doing. Once you've seen all 4 of these routes in the middle act, the 9th phase becomes a menu option, and you can play through the final 4 chapters from here. These create the Akiho route, and the real ending of the game. Things come to a head here, and the group is left back where they started, just Akiho and Kaito. Or possibly just Akiho in one bad ending. To explain, I am going to have to spoil you a bit. Not major spoilers, but it's still a cool moment, so if you're adverse to spoilers, skip ahead to the following timestamp. Okay, so throughout the game, there's been regular quick-time events representing robot fights, usually in the game Kill Ballad. It doesn't matter if you fail or succeed most of these, and sometimes they're impossible to fail. But in this true ending, it does matter. Kai, being the lazy gamer he is, will often resort to, "I'll do it if you can beat me in Kill Ballad," to get out of doing work, as he knows he'll win. Akiho often takes up these challenges thinking that one day she might win, but of course Kai is incredibly competitive and proud, he will never go easy on her. Which takes us to the ending of Chapter 9. Everything has gone wrong, it's just Akiho left wanting to take their giant robot to the Tokyo Expo. And by everything has gone wrong, I really mean that. There's some genuine tension between Akiho and Kai here. Akiho is acting pretty self-centered, but she's clearly at her weakest she's ever been here, and Kai refuses to help her. She begs him and he agrees. If she can beat him at Kill Ballad, he'll help. Akiho knows she can't win, but fights anyway. And here you're given an incredibly easy QTE. To get the good ending, you need to fail the QTE, which honestly is so easy that you'd probably have to be intentionally trying to fail. I really love how much this is a disguised choice. You're the one choosing to have Kai put Aki over his pride. This provides a really nice payoff for how often throughout the game Kai has used this as an excuse to avoid doing things for Akiho. And it bookends the story nicely by going back to the original duo returning to Tokyo, just as they did in Chapter 1. I absolutely love the characterization in this scene, and I love when stories call back to the beginning like this with their ending. But I think to go further beyond, the story should continue a bit past this, so you can't just repeat the beginning. You need to show how things have changed, which the subsequent chapters do show. The cast members who left the group return, now with the potential world-ending stakes that come, and we see how they and their relationships have changed, putting them in a better position to work together and save the world. One big theme, especially in this last act, is fake news. Yep, this 2012 visual novel made an incredibly accurate prediction of the 2019-2020 landscape. Now, I'm not going to make any political statements here, but it's really scary how people on both sides of an argument can believe so strongly that everyone else has fallen for this fake news, when to the outside world the opposite may appear. For a 2020 example, mask wearing and COVID in general, there are people out there absolutely convinced that the entire thing is a hoax and fabricated, and all those people going around wearing masks have fallen for this fake news, when they themselves are the ones denying the science. And this is what helps this final act of the story to land. We know that it's possible to make people believe in a fabricated reality. The augmented reality of Robotics notes ties this in with deep fakes that cause enough panics and misinformation to temporarily disrupt the world order. It's scary because in 2020, we've seen how possible this truly is. The idea of incredibly subtle brainwashing and influencing is a big part of the Kimijima reports, and everything just feels very real. Now, there's also plenty of little spin-off stuff, including a Robotics Notes manga that featured a cameo from Occultic, but the only part that bears mentioning any significant detail in is the anime. The anime for Robotics Notes was fairly well received. I know I liked it when I first watched it, but going back after playing the VN, it really does start to show its holes. It has less episodes than Steins Gate, despite being the longer VN, and it has an interesting way to cover up this. It has a weird habit of skipping through important scenes, only to mention them later in a quick flashback. This does sort of work in that it gets the important information out there, and allows other parts of the runtime to focus on character, but it would still be better if they had more episodes, and didn't just skip these. There are plenty of moments cut, but overall it didn't feel like much had changed, and it was a fairly faithful adaptation. However, it was in the last 6 episodes where this all crashes down. Like I said around 25 minutes ago, Steins Gate worked in anime because of how tight the setup and payoff were, and the anime adaptation of Robotics Notes dropped the ball here a bit. The spoiler scene I mentioned before was the first major change. Not only is the payoff weaker because it lacked player input, but the setup from Kai in previous chapters was noticeably less. For all it did remove, the anime did add in a couple of useful scenes, but overall the stuff it lost felt worse. The final fight in particular lacked the proper setup. They did at least add in a new bit of build-up and payoff in the fight, with Tajirina always dodging to the right in previous battles, but it didn't make up for all that was lost. In the VN, we know that Gun Build 1 has continued being a side project for Akiko, and we learned much earlier about the monopole motors and pile bunkers used for it. These all become vital for the final fight. The smaller Kaminagi robot that comes out of the Sumeragi gets next to no build-up in the anime, whereas the planning for it was part of what gave the fight strategy in the VN. The mostly off-screen efforts from Sawada, Daru and Takumi with anti-committee measures get overlooked, and this means that the overall final battle is just another giant robot fight, rather than the build-up of plot elements. Yes, Daru from Steins Gate and Takumi from ChäoS are both involved here. There's a lot of crossover in this VN. Mr. Brown's daughter Nae is a major character, more main here than in Steins Gate even, and from her you can hear bits and pieces about other members of the Steins Gate cast. Cerner involved in the plot once more, albeit not as the primary threat, and from ChäoS Head, the Noah 2 tech that was vital to the plot has been upgraded to Noah 4 and is vital again here. There's plenty of little references to previous games, but it pales in comparison to the amount of connections for the 6th and final main game for this video, Robotics Notes Dash. Dash is probably the weirdest main game. I know officially it's mainline, but if I'm being honest, it feels more in line with the ChäoS Love Choo Choo sequels. They're both canon sequels to their entry, so I'm not quite sure why this gets to be main and those don't. The dash in the title stands for Daru the Super Hacker, a name Daru has gone by a couple of times on previous occasions. I really have no clue how I feel about this game. On one hand, I loved every moment of it. Well, nearly every moment, I'll get to that. But on the other hand, I felt pretty disappointed. I think more than anything, being a main game, I had set my expectations too high. And I also think, in a way, the short runtime was the biggest factor. It took me just under 24 hours to get all 7 endings, and see everything this VN had to offer. If we consider ChäoS Head to be superseded by ChäoS Head Noah, this is now the shortest entry in the series. And to make matters worse, over half of that time is spent on non-canon what-if stories. Yes, they were really enjoyable, but when the main plot only kicks in the last 4 hours, I just wanted more. So the story. It's been 6 months since the end of Robotics Notes, and we're in the summer of 2020. And the Robotics Club have changed since then. Kai's left the island to go study on the mainland, Juna's gotten a job as part of a large company, and Akiho, she's just ended up working as a waitress. Subaru and Frau haven't graduated yet, but Subaru's now become the club president. There was a sort of coming-of-age feel to the first Robotics Notes that I didn't mention earlier, because I think here manages to capture that even better. The first game featured characters on the cusp of becoming adults, and a lot of the character moments were all about looking towards the future and where they wanted their life to go. For example, Akiho's big life goal was to build this giant robot before she graduated. She achieved that, and the question of where now was always in the air, but that comes to the forefront in Dash. Dash is really down to earth in the character writing department, without being either overly cynical or overly cheesy. It shows that in real life people don't just have an end point, that they don't have one big moment and then happily ever after. People can keep growing and learning, and it's the same with the problems solved from the previous games here, like Subaru's relationship with his father. It's not just something you quickly fix and then it's done, it's something that needs to be kept working at. Aki's struggles in particular, seeing the once passionate group leader no longer able to join in with what she used to love, and having to leave it to her juniors because she has adult commitments, is extremely relatable to me. Kai certainly has changed too, and become much more normal feeling, but I miss the old Kai a lot. He feels a lot more like a generic anime protagonist, something the series has managed to avoid for the protagonist thus far. And that actually stays true here. Neither Aki or Kai are actually the protagonist, and instead it's Daru. I know he's the character in the title, but I was surprised with just how much more time he gets as a perspective character than anyone else. It's probably him around 70% of the time, but this is the final piece that completes the puzzle. It's been 10 years since we last saw Daru, and he's become a father in that time, but what's really notable is how in many ways he hasn't changed. He's become more tactful when needed and certainly wiser, but at his core, he's still very much the same man. This makes a good parallel with Kai, who's been gone for months and has in some ways grown apart from his friends. Daru delivers a message here about how, even though people may change, deep down inside they're still that same kid they used to be. And this idea of people continuing to change but reconciling this with parts of a person that are constant appears in many roots of this story, and Daru is oh so perfect to show that. The other great thing Daru brings with him is the rest of the Steins Gate cast, or at least their tweets. Any point where you're playing as Daru, you can pull out Twipo and check the tweets of other lab members. Okabe, however, is just a hoeing Kyoma bot until the end of the game. Like its precursor, Dash is broken up into 3 acts, but in a much more obvious way. The first act stars Kaito and Daru, both of whom arrive back on Tanegashima right before a 2-week gun and robot festival, working together against an AI copy of the previous antagonist, with a sort of buddy movie feel. It does feel a little fanfiction here as a premise there, but the antagonist did say that they would return as a second and third iteration, if they were taken down in the original game. And AI has been a major part of both the original Robotics Notes and Steins Gate Zero, so this is all fine in theory. During the 2 chapters that make up this first act, there are moments where you can choose what part of the festival to have Daru and Kai visit, and these determine which of the 5 second act chapters you'll see. It basically amounts to seeing all of that character's events during the first act to activate their chapter. There are chapters for Juna, Frau, Subaru, Airi and Nae. In the first 4 you'll play as Daru for the vast majority of the time, while the Nae chapter lets Kai take back the main character role. These stories really vary in tone and plot, but all of them explore their root character in some really great detail. It's really a shame that they can't all be canon, as they're pretty much mutually exclusive. As well as the root character, Daru is really a highlight. You get to see a lot of different sides to him as he interacts with the Robot Club members, and actually being in his head helps to make him a rounded,
like a barrel,
character. He ends up easily deserving a spot alongside the other science adventure protagonists. I honestly can't stress how much I enjoyed the character moments in this game. After you've seen all 5 routes, a new option will appear in the main menu, allowing you to play Akiho's chapter, the canon version of the week these 5 chapters took place over. As the true follow-up to the first act, this chapter does have some actual regular science adventure style plot, but at its core is focused on Akiho and Kai's relationship. Until the first game, they were childhood friends who were always together. In the original game, you could see moments of strain in their relationship as Akiho felt Kai leaving her behind. And now he's been gone from the island for months, there's a lot of distance between them. Both of them are terrible with expressing their feelings directly and do not understand subtlety in the slightest, much to the frustration of both each other and those around them. But when they finally do get to spend time together and actually express their feelings, it's very earned and gives some great closure to their romantic subplot. I was surprised how little Akiho's sister Misaki factored into her route, but I was actually happy because there's some really annoying glitches in the Switch version that only affects Misaki's model. She's permanently stuck in a twitching A pose. It's incredibly immersion breaking, and I ended up rushing through text while she was on screen for that reason. It's such a little thing, but when the character writing is this good, I really get into the story, and this just takes me out of it. And it did hurt my overall experience. This was the bit I meant when I said earlier how I loved nearly every moment. But it's not quite over. When you visit the title screen, the menu music has changed to have elements of the Steins Gate theme, Gate of Steiner, and there's one final character chapter you can pick, the Daru chapter. This takes place a couple of days after Akiho's chapter, and everything seems to have resolved itself. And this is the chapter where the game finally feels like a true science adventure entry, for the final 3 hours. The final battle here makes good use of every single character, and really shows how all of their relationships have grown. I love it, but it could be so much more. We get all these Steins Gate characters with little roles in the plot. Maho from Zero helps out in a big way during the final chapter. The events of ChäoS Head and Child help to explain what happened in this game. Daru even basically has a moment where he says, "Play ChäoS Head if you want an explanation." And of course the ties to the original Robotics notes are obvious. This is such a culmination title, but when the main story is this short, it's a little disappointing. However, it makes me very excited for future games, as by this point it appears like most of the previous game casts have all met, even if mostly off screen, and could set up for a real Avengers moment to come. Where to now then? I've covered all the games, right? I said earlier that there's probably 7 main games currently released? Yeah, we're getting to that probably part. Occultic 9 really messes everything up here. It's not in the same continuity as the rest of the series. It began as a series of light novels rather than a visual novel. Originally it was thought this took place in a sister series to the science adventure series, known as the Science Visual Novel series, despite the fact that at the time it was a light novel and an anime, not a visual novel. In this universe, the science adventure series exists as fiction, so how can this be part of the main series? World layers. What is a world layer? Good question. They're going to be very important to the second entry in this continuity, Anonymous Code, which we don't know much about yet. It was originally announced back in 2015 and has been through a fairly lengthy development. We know that world layers are layers of reality, and that they infinitely extend above and below. Occultic 9 and Anonymous Code take place one level above Steins Gate and the rest of the series. Anyway, now that Occultic 9 is considered part of the Science Adventure series, there's an enhanced version coming, Occultic 9 New World, which is said to make clearer connections to the rest of the series. This is coming out on Switch, and as an update for PS4 and Xbox One. Occultic 9 isn't available in visual novel form in English, but the original light novel is available officially translated, but it's not finished. However, it seems likely that once New World releases in Japanese, we'll get an official translation over here. So we've got 2 VNs on their way, Occultic 9 New World and Anonymous Code. But does that mean the original world layer has been abandoned? I was worried this might be the case, since Anonymous Code is stated to conclude a lot of things from the Science Adventure series. But it appears that this isn't the case, as there's a third upcoming game. Steins something. This isn't a Steins Gate game, it's a new separate branch, in the same way that ChäoS Child is separate from ChäoS Head. The actors for Okabe, Daru and Kurisu are attached to the project, however they look unlikely to be major characters, instead it would focus on new characters. We don't know much else about the VN, it's currently planned for after Anonymous Code and is a spiritual successor to Steins Gate, as Chiyomaru Shikura, the series director, feels as though that story has already been told and doesn't need a pure sequel. The reason for this existing is pretty cynical. ChäoS Child, despite getting great critical reception, only sold about 10% of Steins Gate. Using the Steins brand for a sequel rather than the lesser known ChäoS branding will almost certainly result in greater sales. But this actually seems reassuring to me. They're not milking Steins Gate beyond its name for publicity, so I've got every faith that this game won't be phoned in at all, and I'm really looking forward to meeting a whole new cast of characters to fall in love with. This video ended up being about 50% longer than I anticipated, and there's still so much more I could have talked about. So for the 10% of viewers who made it this far, thank you. Hopefully that means you enjoyed this, so if you did, maybe consider subscribing. I'm not uploading too much, but I'm trying to make any videos I do upload be more like this from now on. Different topics, but yeah, if you want to see similar videos to this, that's what's coming. Alright, look after yourselves, and I'll see you next time.